How's it going, guys and geeks? Welcome to the Geekritique show. My name is Dakota. Today we're going to be ranking every book that I read in 2019. I know it's a little bit late, we're in 2020 already, but I hope you enjoyed the video all the same. A few shout outs before we begin. Zach, you were awesome. You brought in the new year with our Geekritique jumper. Thank you so much. I think that version of the jumper is actually one of a kind, so you are a very lucky man. And thank you for supporting our channel. If you guys want to help support our content, you can always find down below some of our merch listed there. I also want to give a shout out to Daniel Greene, who invited us onto his program for the final video of his channel in 2019. He asked a bunch of us what our favorite reads of the year were, and Jen and I were able to chime in with our thoughts on our top reads for 2019. You can find that video linked in the description down below. And last but not least, I have to thank Audible, because I was a slacker this year. I actually did not physically read, or digitally read a single book or novel this year. This is the first year I think that's ever happened. But because I work in construction now, I'm an electrician, I have a lot of time alone, so I listen to Audible for the majority of my day. I think Audible told me that I listened to about 450 plus hours last year. So all the books that I read this year were audiobooks. So bear with me, I'm going to be reviewing the books themselves though, not necessarily the performance, unless it was a good performance. So I have everything listed down below. Here we have, I think I have 43 books listed here. I'm going to share my thoughts on each of them, put them S being the highest tier and D being the lowest tier, U being unfinished. I just want to throw those in there because some of those books that I didn't finish were actually pretty good. So I'm going to start with Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Now, this was really interesting when I started reading it. I don't remember much of it though. What I can say, I thought his daily routine was very interesting. This is a emperor of Rome, so it's very rare that you get the opportunity to get in the mind of a ruler of a country, a ruler of an empire. So I would say C. It was a short read, but it was kind of forgettable for me. Not terrible, but yeah. Star Trek, The Captain's Oath. This is the first Star Trek book I ever read. I mentioned that I was going to start with this one. I even bought it on one of the videos that I shared a little while back, the video where I explained why I have over 500 Star Trek books, but hadn't read any of them. I have finally read some Star Trek books, and I will have to say Star Trek The Captain's Oath was a highlight of my year. The book takes place over several different time periods leading up to James T. Kirk's captaining of the Enterprise. And I found that the different plot threads all came together near the end. And I thought that I always love when they do that. So I think that was a great read for me, Captain's Oath. If you haven't checked out that book and you like Star Trek, I highly recommend it. Obviously, the Star Trek books were never considered canon, but it's fun reading. And it's probably better Star Trek than you're getting on TV currently. Joseph Campbell, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is a hard book to get into. I wanted to read this because it's kind of what Star Wars was based on. I believe it was said that George Lucas always carried a copy of Joseph Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which outlines the hero's journey, the monomyth, if you will. I will have to say I'm going to put this in C tier, maybe B tier. I don't know. I would say B tier because it did... I think this was the first book that I read this year that kind of guided my journey into what I was going to be reading ultimately throughout the year. And while I didn't set out 2019 to reading different books than I normally read, which are usually just fantasy and science fiction, I wanted to branch out a bit, do some side quests that I've always been meaning to do that I never actually completed. And it started with The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and it kind of colored where I was going to be going next. The order I'm doing this in is alphabetical, based on the author's last name, or if the author is unknown, because there are some older works in here that don't have defined authors, based on like who translated it last. So Joseph Campbell, I think Hero with a Thousand Faces, it's super enlightening. Basically, it explains how most, if not all, mythology is based around the hero's journey. It's a 12-step journey, and a lot of Star Wars is based on that. Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. I'm going to place it in you. Although I will say it's probably one of the best books I'm currently reading, and I did read this year. I have never been into reading history for fun. I've always enjoyed history, but reading history for fun is never something that I've actually set out to do. Well, you know what? Jen bought this book because she was really into the Hamilton play, which she's never seen, but she really likes the soundtrack. And I thought I'd give it a go. It's a really long read. It's about 30 hours. I'm probably about halfway through at this point. But it's something that I have to read in chunks because it's something that I'm not used to. But I would probably rate it closer to the A tier for me, just because it's such an interesting and fascinating person, and Chernow just nails each chapter of his life. Delilah S. Dawson's Black Spire. I read a lot of Star Wars books. This one is a tie-in to the Galaxy's Edge theme park, and as such, it does feel like a tie-in and not necessarily something that should belong in the canon. The characters are interesting. I love the characters because they're carried over from the Phasma book that Delilah S. Dawson also wrote, but this one didn't do anything for me. I think I'm going to leave it in C tier. It wasn't a bad book, but it just did not grab me in any way. And ultimately, it felt like, a what to do in Galaxy's Edge sort of book. I don't know. It wasn't all that great. Probably one of the strongest reads this year. The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. Jen had to read this for school. She didn't have the time to read it, so she bought it on my Audible account. Wow. I do cry when it's warranted, but I cried during this book. Frederick Douglass being a former slave who found freedom. He ran away from his masters and became a voice for the abolitionist movement. I love this read. It's nice and short, and the narrator killed it. I forget the narrator's name at this point, but there's one moment where he's praying for release, and it's one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever listened to, because it actually came from Frederick Douglass himself. This is his writing. So I would say that was probably one of the strongest reads of my year, and I'm so happy I actually got around to doing that. The Labors of Hercules, I will have to place in D tier. It's just, I was very, very disappointed, not necessarily by the translation, because I feel the translation was strong by Edward Ferry, but it was very short. I don't know what I was expecting, but I wasn't expecting that necessarily, and I thought it was, interesting and enlightening as to what the Greeks believed. Not very engaging. Now, continuing with the mythology theme, Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology, I would put that, it's somewhere between A and B. Norse mythology is Neil Gaiman's interpretation of the Norse tales, the Norse myths, but through his voice. Now, what's great about Norse mythology, and all mythology really, is that it's retellings, and with each retelling, you're supposed to be doing it in your own voice, and Neil Gaiman has such a fascinating voice for storytelling, and this is really about telling stories. And you know what? Because of that, I think I'm going to place it in A tier. I think it is such a strong read, and I think it's just a fascinating look into Viking culture, Norse mythology, and just that chapter of human history through the lens of Neil Gaiman's quirkiness. Alien 3, this is a Audible original audio drama of the original script for Alien 3, not the Alien 3 that we received on film. It was far better than the actual film that we actually received. That said, it didn't really do all that much for me, so I'm going to actually put it down in C tier. It didn't really do that much for me. Master and Apprentice. If I were to nominate one Star Wars book for S tier, this is... If you ever see a Star Wars book written by Claudia Gray, you pick that up. You pick it up! She's so good. She's so good with characters. She understands those characters better than I think the actors do themselves. With Master and Apprentice, she shows the journey of Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan while Obi-Wan is still a young apprentice. And, they start to uncover some of the prophecies that are going to be foretold in the coming films. And it's so good. It's about basically how they learn to get along, because there's such different personality types. And she gets it. She nails it so well. Not her best Star Wars book, but one of them. Graham Hancock, Fingerprints of the Gods. I have to be honest with this one. This was a fun little read. I don't necessarily believe everything in them. What they propose is that humans have gone through many different cycles of cataclysms. You can kind of uncover that through the different legends and myths and cultures and things that were left behind from cultures that we don't even know who they are or how they did what they did. And he goes into, the Egyptian culture, the Sumerian culture, to even older cultures. And I find it fascinating. I don't believe everything that he reads or that he says, but I thought that was a really, really good, fun read. With Fingerprints of the Gods, his original book where he breaks everything down, it's one of the stronger reads, but I think Magicians of the Gods is a little bit... I would actually place Fingerprints of the Gods as an A-tier book because it's so interesting and it's so engaging and you just want to keep reading. But when you give it a little bit of thought after the fact, it doesn't always, ring true. Some of the stuff in it is a little bit outdated because I believe it's from the 90s. Magicians of the God is his sequel to that. I think it's a 20-year later sequel. And it's not as good. I think most of the information he covered in Fingerprints of the Gods is retread here. Sovereign by Jeff Hirsch. This was a fun read, believe it or not. It was an Audible original. It's clearly a young adult story that... It's about a young boy who's 12 or 13 who is separated from his family, who are like alien botanists, basically. They go to different worlds to check out the life forms on it, and he gets lost and he has to survive on this alien world for a number of days. And it's really fascinating, the journey this kid goes through, and I think the arc of the character is fascinating too. So, not a great book, not a terrible book, and it was fun to read, and it was free because it was part of the Audible original monthly program. Robin Hobb is one of my favorite fantasy authors, and her Fitz Chivalry Farseer series is absolutely one of the best. Period. I struggle to give Assassin's Apprentice an A tier though, because I will say of I believe it's 9 books in the Farseer series, Assassin's Apprentice, it requires a lot of lead up. So I think in years prior, because this is a reread, in years prior I would have put Assassin's Apprentice maybe A tier, maybe S tier, but as a reread, B tier, because most of the good stuff happens in the next couple books. Njál's Saga. While we were in Iceland, Jen and I decided I was going to read up on some of the sagas that Iceland was so known for. Unfortunately, I didn't finish it. It was really cool reading how they wrote, how they interpreted the family structure and the governmental structure of their island. It's based on Vikings, and I think that's fascinating. And whether or not it's true or not, I don't know, and I don't think anyone really knows, but it's an interesting look because Viking history is super muddied. H.P. Lovecraft, The Complete Omnibus. I thought this was a really fascinating read. I would put it B tier. Basically, it's all of... They found a way to, chronologically place all of his stories. This is volume 1 of that series. It doesn't touch on a lot of the bigger Cthulhu mythos stuff, but it does show his journey as a pulp writer, a horror writer, a camp writer, all the way through the years. I would actually maybe place, maybe B. Yeah, tentatively, I'll put that at B. Thanos by Barry Lyga. Thanos Titan Consumed. An interesting book. I think it was supposed to be canon, but for whatever reason, they decided to change that. And I think because of it, it sullied my experience reading it a little bit. But it was interesting. I think ultimately pointless. Unfortunately, I really enjoyed it. I just wish... What Marvel does really terribly is incorporating some of the external stuff into their MCU. Because if it's not on film, they have no problem overwriting it, and sometimes they overwrite their films. So I would place that in C tier. It was okay. It was It was enjoyable. Paula McLean, A Mind of Her Own, is a little novella, an Audible original. I don't really remember much from it, but I do remember enjoying it quite a bit when I read it. It's kind of the story about Marie Curie and like when she first showed up in Paris, before she made most of her like big breakthroughs, before her Nobel Prizes and everything. Short read, fun read. I don't have any problem with it, but it wasn't my taste. So I'll put it in D tier. Gilgamesh, or the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's the earliest known recorded story ever. And it has many Genesis parallels. I find that fascinating. I would put that right next to Fingerprints of the Gods. Stephen Mitchell did a really good job of translating that story. I thought it was fascinating. I think if you're interested at all in ancient culture, Gilgamesh is one of the more fascinating reads ever. Last Shot, Daniel Jose Older. This is a tie-in novel to Solo. Probably my least favorite Star Wars movie, if I'm being honest. I struggle to place it any higher than a C. I would also put that next to Thanos because whatever. Neil Oliver, The Vikings. I read this in the lead up to my trip to Iceland, and it's basically like a new history of the Vikings, basically remapping what we know, because we know so very little about their history, and he goes back quite a bit. Ultimately, it wasn't really my cup of tea. I struggle putting it in D tier, but it really didn't captivate me like these other ones. Star Trek Prometheus, this series by, I believe the author's name is Bernd Perplier. It's the first official Star Trek novel written in a foreign language, and this is translated into English. I haven't actually read the third in the series yet, or I started it, but I haven't finished it, so I'm going to put that in unfinished. But Fire with Fire, I would put maybe C tier, but Root of All Rage, the second book, B tier. That was extremely strong. This series takes place, I think, 17 or 18 years after all the main shows end, and it kind of dives into the aspect of galactic terrorism and how that affects the Federation and all of that. I really, really appreciated the politics of it. I put the first book in C tier because it took a little bit to get into it, to understand who the main characters were. So there's that. Jordan B. Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. I like reading books from all sides of the political spectrum just because I want to know what everyone thinks. And ultimately, I thought that his 12 Rules for Life book was, really solid. Very good advice. I would place it in B tier. I think the audiobook for 12 Rules for Life was especially heartwarming because he does get into his own personal life quite a bit and some of the struggles he has had with his family. And there's a chapter where he's literally just like, he's struggling to finish it, reading it, because it's such a deep emotional topic for him. You actually hear the author tearing up. He read it himself. 12 Rules for Life, I think it's a fascinating read. I don't think it will, besides the fact that many people don't find him appealing on a political level, I don't think that has anything to do with whatever's in this book. I think anyone can find practical value in his work. So check that out if you're interested. If not, no problem. Plato's Republic. I love this book. It's tough to get into because of the narrative structure of what Plato does. Basically, he has this whole setup. I don't know if it's a fictional conversation, but it's a conversation spurred on by Socrates and some of his students. Basically, like, what is a republic? I'm describing this poorly, but basically they break down how to make the perfect republic. And obviously it isn't perfect because no human government has ever been perfect. But it's fascinating how they were able to, or Plato was able to, through the eyes and words of Socrates, come up with this entire culture, a fictional culture, that would, kind of spur on how America was formed, I believe, just based on the structure of it all. I thought that was really cool. Constantine the Emperor. Going to put you right next to the Vikings. I really wanted to get into some of the historical works that I've been meaning to touch on, and I was very interested in Constantine for whatever reason at a certain point. I love learning about how he came into power, the story behind that, and how he I find it so interesting how he adopted Christianity, pushed all his like pagan beliefs and the pagan beliefs of these different cultures, and kind of meshed a new form of Christianity. I found that super interesting. I think it's worth reading. Ultimately, I think the book drags a little bit. I would actually maybe place it a little higher than the Vikings. Maybe C tier. I thought it is a very fascinating read, but it does drag a little bit. And some of the more interesting stuff is breezed over a little bit, like the Council of Nicaea and stuff. Screwball. This is a fun read, actually. I struggle to rate it very high. I would maybe call it C tier. Screwball is basically like a comedic take on Babe Ruth's early life and how he became one of the big leagues in baseball history. And Jen and I recently got into baseball. She's a huge Yankees fan, being from the Bronx. Make all your Yankees jokes now. But there's no getting around the fact that Babe Ruth was a legend. So this is like a comedic take on the true story of his life up until he joined the major leagues. Star Wars Resistance Reborn. I was really disappointed with this book. I thought it would have more to do with bridging the story a little bit, but it was just kind of like a buffer. Last Jedi 2.0. That said, I thought it was a strong enough read where I didn't have too many qualms. I would call it B tier. A very average Star Wars book. Arabian Nights. Now, this was actually one of the classic reads that I truly, truly enjoyed this year. This isn't the entire Arabian Nights. This is volume 1 of an audio drama, so it goes into a couple of the stories in it. But I thought the way it was done and the intricacy of each of the stories was fascinating enough on its own merit to be an enjoyable read. Elantris by Brandon Sanderson. I want to place it in D tier because I did not like it, but I didn't finish it, so I can't. What I did get to read was Edge Dancer. That, believe it or not, was one of the best books I read, and it's a novella of his that takes place between books 2 and 3 of the Stormlight Archive. But the big boy, Oathbringer, I finally got to read Oathbringer. S tier, no doubt about it. Brandon Sanderson is a legend. Definitely, Stormlight Archive is my favorite series currently. Probably my favorite series I've ever read. There's nothing in the books that I dislike. Maybe some of the character choices, but other than that, it's just one of the most fantastical stories I have ever read. I'm just going to push it up to the top of the S tier because it's amazing. Last Wish by Andrzej Sapkowski. It's the first book of short stories for The Witcher. I wanted to read it before the Netflix show started. I would say Last Wish was definitely B tier. The strongest book of the bunch for me was Sword of Destiny. That's the second book of short stories. And Sword of Destiny kind of ties together most of the plot threads that are important from the first 2 books of short stories in the last 2 stories of that book. And I find that I was blown away. I was like, Dad, you got to read this book. I called my dad immediately and said, you got to read it. So that was cool. Blood of Elves. Found it real boring. Dooku, Jedi Lost. It's a book that was adapted. It's actually a screenplay, so it's meant to be an audio drama. I would put it B tier. I found that the early story of Dooku as a young Jedi was really cool. I thought they nailed that story and his descent into darkness, but there were gaps in it that I wish were filled in a little bit better because some of the leaps that he does take seem a little drastic. I've never read Hamlet before, but I finally got around to doing it. It was amazing. It's a fantastic story. Did it really touch me all that much? Not necessarily. I kind of wish I was a bigger Shakespeare fan. Maybe I'll read more Shakespeare this year, but I would place Hamlet in B tier. Audible also did a rendition of Treasure Island. I would actually go ahead and put this in A tier. It kind of took a little while for me to get through it and finish it, but I realize now how important that book is in terms of how we experience adventure stories. That was pretty much one of the first, and this is the birth of the pirate genre. The idea of buried treasure comes from this story. It blows my mind. I've never even thought that pirates didn't actually bury treasure. Anyway, Treasure Island. Definitely give it a read if you are interested, or listen. This is a really good Audible original. It's like an audio drama. Tolkien's The Silmarillion. Now, this is one of the hardest books to place on this list. It was my favorite book I think I read this year because it's one of the books that I've wanted to read for the longest time. But I was, for a long time, I was too immature to just get through the first couple chapters. But once you understand the stories of the Silmarillion, once you understand how powerful the music of the story is, it's unfortunate that it was released posthumously because I want to know exactly what Tolkien would have wanted to release. But it was edited by Christopher Tolkien, his son. The Silmarillion is not as good as The Lord of the Rings, in my opinion, but it definitely makes the elves a lot more interesting. And I didn't think I ever wanted that because they were so cool in the movies. But definitely give that a read if you have the stamina, because it is heavy. Neil deGrasse Tyson's Astrophysics for People in a Hurry. Believe it or not, I liked it when I read it. It's a short read. It's a short listen, maybe 3 hours on audiobook, and you happen to learn quite a bit about the natural universe, or at least what we know of it or think we know of it. I thought that was really cool. Maybe B tier. Maybe B tier. Yeah. The average books. The Art of War by Sun Tzu. I'll be honest, I didn't get anything out of this book. I thought I was, in the moment, a lot of practical information for warfare and setting up camps and breaking down camps, but I don't remember anything. The Man Who Knew the Way to the Moon by Todd Swillick. This is the story of literally the man who had the calculations to go to the moon. I had never heard of this man before, but I thought it was really a fun little listen when I actually got around to doing it, and it was right around the time of the anniversary of the moon landing, so I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to help support the channel, you can always start a free 30-day trial of Audible and get one book free, as well as any 2 Audible originals. I think if you have a Prime account, you actually get 2 books free. Let me know how that goes by clicking the link in the description down below. What did you guys think of the variation in books that I read this year? I hope this video wasn't too long, but this is something that I've been wanting to do since maybe October, and I finally got around to doing it. I was hoping to get these 4 done as well, Hamilton, Njál Saga, the last Prometheus book, and Elantris, so that I can fully get this up and ready, but because I was laid off, I didn't have the time to listen to it on Audible, so I got busy with other things when I was home, unfortunately. But I hope you liked the video. I hope you agree with some of the choices that I put on the list. And if you do or don't, let me know your thoughts. What did you read this year? What was your favorite read? I would love to know your thoughts. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, please subscribe and, click the like button, all those YouTube things. If you want to check out some more videos right now, you can go right there and see some more of our content. Thank you so much. Have a good one.